It is a winter night at Sandringham House in Norfolk, and the clock in the courtyard tower is striking softly against a dark sky. Somewhere behind its dials, an inscription for a dead prince reminds visitors that the hours perish and will be charged to our account, carved there after Prince Albert Victor's death in 1892. Inside, the entrance hall plaque still reads, "This house was built by Albert Edward, Prince of Wales, and Alexandra his wife in the year of our Lord 1870. The limestone dressings and Jacobethan gables glow faintly under electric light, catching on gilded frames in the polished banister worn smooth by generations of royal hands. This was built as a private refuge on a 20,000-acre estate of woodland, chutes, and quiet power. It became, in time, the place where kings went to work, celebrate Christmas, grow old, and die. Tonight, the house is calm, but the clock tower keeps counting down. In November 1862, Queen Victoria purchased Sandringham Hall and roughly 8,000 acres of Norfolk land for her 21-year-old son, Albert Edward, Prince of Wales. The price was $220,000, a substantial sum intended to provide the young heir with a country estate well away from town, a phrase that appeared repeatedly in royal correspondence during this period. The Queen's intention was clear: to ground her restless eldest son in the responsibilities of land ownership and rural life, hoping that managing an estate might temper the socializing tendencies that worried her. The property Victoria purchased had its own history. Sandringham Hall had been built in the late 18th century for Cornish Henley, though by 1862 it had passed through several owners. The most recent, Charles Spencer Cowper, had made his own improvements, but the house remained what it had always been: a comfortable Georgian country house of the sort owned by prosperous gentry throughout England. Red brick, white-painted window frames, and a modest columned entrance suggested solid respectability rather than grandeur. Early photographs and engravings show the original hall as it appeared when the prince first took possession. 2 stories of symmetrical Georgian proportions surrounded by parkland dotted with mature trees. The Norfolk landscape stretched flat and sandy around it, marked by coverts of oak and beech, open fields worked by tenant farmers, and the kind of quiet rural scenery that characterized this corner of East Anglia. It was countryside that made few demands on the eye, gentle, agricultural, and far removed from the architectural drama of royal palaces. Albert Edward and Princess Alexandra of Denmark, married in March 1863, took up residence that spring. Estate correspondence from their early months describes the couple settling into rooms that were pleasant but hardly palatial. Alexandra wrote to her mother in Denmark describing long walks through woods where the loudest sound was birdsong, and evenings spent quietly in rooms still being furnished to their taste. For a brief period, Sandringham functioned as what Queen Victoria had intended: a private refuge where a young royal couple could establish domestic life away from public scrutiny. The estate agent John Turner appears in documents from 1862 onward as the practical facilitator of this royal domesticity. His reports to the prince detailed the condition of tenant farms, the state of woodland, and the potential of the sandy Norfolk soil for game preservation, a topic that would come to dominate Sandringham's purpose. Turner's correspondence reveals a man navigating between the expectations of a royal client and the practical realities of rural estate management, translating the prince's desires into contracts, building plans, and agricultural improvements. From almost the beginning, however, the house presented problems. Albert Edward found it too small, a phrase that appears in his private letters with increasing frequency during the 1860s. What had been adequate for a country squire proved insufficient for a Prince of Wales whose social obligations required constant entertaining. Shooting parties, weekend guests, visiting dignitaries, and the simple apparatus of royal life all demanded more space than the Georgian hall could provide. The conservatory, designed by architect Samuel Toulon in the early 1860s, represented an early attempt to address this shortage. Attached to one side of the house, it provided additional reception space in a style one architectural historian later described as exuberant to the point of eccentricity. Toulon's Gothic ironwork and elaborate glazing sat awkwardly against the plain brick of the main house, a visible sign that Sandringham was already being adapted to purposes its original builders had never imagined. Estate plans from 1863 and 1864 show other improvements: enlarged stables to accommodate more horses and carriages, expanded kitchens to feed larger numbers of guests and servants, and modifications to service spaces that were struggling to keep pace with the household's growing scale. Each alteration attempted to stretch the Georgian house to contain Victorian royal life, but these incremental changes could not solve the fundamental problem of size and organization. By 1865, the estate itself had grown significantly. Additional purchases of surrounding farmland expanded Sandringham to nearly 20,000 acres, creating a consolidated block of royal property that made it one of the larger private estates in Norfolk. Maps from the period show the prince systematically buying out neighboring landowners, redrawing boundaries until Sandringham became not just a house and park, but a substantial rural domain with its own villages, tenant farms, and woodlands. The prince walked these lands with the attention of a man learning a new role. Queen Victoria's hope that land ownership would instill responsibility found some vindication in her son's genuine interest in agricultural improvement and game management. Estate records show him consulting with land agents about drainage projects, questioning tenant farmers about crop yields, and taking particular interest in the woodland management that would make Sandringham famous as a shooting estate. The game books that begin in the mid-1860s record modest numbers, a few thousand pheasant and partridge per season, figures typical for a well-managed sporting estate. But even these early records hint at the direction Sandringham would take. The prince's enthusiasm for shooting was already apparent, and the Norfolk coverts were being carefully managed to maximize bird populations. What began as gentleman's sport would eventually become industrial-scale hunting, but in these early years it remained within conventional bounds. Inside the house, Alexandra's presence began to transform the interior. Photographs from the late 1860s show rooms filled with the kind of personal touches that distinguished a home from an institution. Photographs in silver frames, flowers arranged in vases, the comfortable clutter of daily family life. The princess had brought from Denmark a preference for bright, informal domesticity that softened the more rigid protocols of English court life. Her influence made Sandringham feel less like a royal duty and more like genuine refuge. Yet, even as the couple settled into this domestic rhythm, the fundamental inadequacy of the house became impossible to ignore. Guest lists grew longer, social obligations expanded, and the Georgian Hall's compact plan simply could not accommodate the life the prince needed to lead. By 1868, correspondence reveals that demolition was being seriously discussed. The house Victoria had purchased as a suitable gift would have to be entirely replaced. Contemporary accounts do not record the Queen's reaction to learning that her carefully chosen estate would need to be torn down and rebuilt. Perhaps she had come to accept that her son's requirements differed from her initial expectations. Perhaps she recognized that the role of Prince of Wales demanded architectural expression that a modest country house could not provide. Or perhaps she simply authorized the expenditure with the resignation of a mother who had learned that her son would ultimately have his way. Estate records from 1869 note the decision with bureaucratic brevity. Demolition would proceed, and a new house would rise in its place. Architects were consulted, plans were drawn, and builders prepared to erase 8 years of royal residence and replace it with something more substantial. The Georgian Sandringham Hall, which had stood for nearly a century, would disappear to make way for Victorian ambitions. The last photograph of the original house shows it on a quiet afternoon, its windows reflecting Norfolk sky, its brick walls still solid, despite the architectural death sentence already passed. Somewhere in those rooms were the traces of the young couple's first years together, worn. Floorboards from rearranged furniture, smoke-darkened walls above fireplaces, marks on doorframes recording the ordinary wear of domestic life. All of this would soon be gone, replaced by a building designed not just to house royal life, but to express it in brick, stone, and carefully calculated architectural ambition. The Norfolk soil that had supported one building would support another. The cycles of construction and destruction that define every great estate had begun, though no one standing before the old hall in its final months could have predicted how many further changes that same ground would witness in the century to come. By 1869, the decision to demolish the original Sandringham Hall was final. The architect chosen for its replacement was A.J. Humbert, whose previous work included commercial and institutional buildings, but few country houses of comparable ambition. His commission was to design a residence that would serve both as private family home and as stage for the social and political functions expected of the Prince of Wales, a dual purpose that would shape every aspect of the new building's plan and appearance. Humbert's drawings, preserved in the Royal Archives, show a house in the Jacobethan style, a Victorian interpretation of late Tudor and early Stuart architecture characterized by red brick walls, tall chimneys, ornate gables, and liberal use of decorative stonework. This style had become fashionable for country houses in the mid-19th century, offering an association with English historical tradition while allowing for the incorporation of modern conveniences. At Sandringham, Humbert created a deliberately irregular facade that suggested organic growth over centuries, though the entire structure would be built in a single concentrated campaign. Demolition of the old hall began in early 1869. No photographs survive of this process, the moment when Georgian walls came down and rooms where Alexandra and Albert Edward had spent their first years of married life were reduced to rubble. What remains are contract documents recording payments to demolition crews, specifications for clearing the site, and instructions for salvaging materials that might be reused in outbuildings or sold to offset costs. Construction of the new house proceeded rapidly. The builders were Goggs Brothers of Swaffham, a local firm whose account books recorded the daily rhythm of construction, cartloads of brick delivered from nearby kilns, Ketton stone brought from Lincolnshire quarries for window and door surrounds, timber framing raised by teams of carpenters, and the slow vertical accumulation of materials into architecture. By late 1870, the house was sufficiently complete for the prince and princess to move into rooms that still smelled of fresh plaster and new wood. The new Sandringham centered on the saloon, a vast ground-floor space that served simultaneously as entrance hall, living room, and social theater. Humbert's plan made this room the organizing principle of the entire house, with other spaces radiating outward in a layout that emphasized circulation and visual drama over the compact efficiency of Georgian planning. The saloon rose through 2 stories, its height and volume calculated to impress visitors while maintaining domestic comfort through careful arrangement of furniture, decorative objects, and the layered complexity of Victorian interior design. Entry came through a porte cochère, a covered carriage porch that allowed visitors to alight from their vehicles and step directly into the saloon without exposure to Norfolk weather. This architectural gesture, borrowed from French chateau design, signaled the house's ambitions before guests crossed the threshold. Inside, they encountered a space whose scale announced royal status, while its furnishings and decoration suggested comfortable domesticity, a carefully balanced synthesis of grandeur and intimacy. The exterior employed red brick manufactured locally, with Ketton stone dressings providing pale contrast around windows and doorways. The roofline was deliberately varied, a picturesque arrangement of gables, chimneys, and projecting bays that created visual interest while suggesting the kind of additive growth typical of buildings that had evolved over centuries. This calculated irregularity represented high Victorian taste, asymmetry as artistic choice rather than accident, historical association as aesthetic strategy. Interior planning followed standard Victorian principles of segregation. Family rooms occupied one wing, guest bedrooms another, and service spaces were tucked into a rear extension where kitchens, sculleries, and servants' quarters formed their own functional world. These zones were connected but separate, with distinct circulation paths ensuring that family, guests, and servants moved through the building along routes that rarely intersected except at moments of orchestrated service. Colonel R.W. Edis, who would later become deeply involved in Sandringham's architectural evolution, began his association with the estate in these early years, consulting on decorative details and interior finishes. His role initially consisted of harmonizing Humbert's work and ensuring that the building's stylistic language remained consistent across different phases of construction. This relationship would deepen over subsequent decades as the house underwent successive expansions. Furniture and decorative objects came primarily from the London firm Holland and Sons, whose craftsmen produced pieces specifically designed for Sandringham's principal rooms. Estate records itemize these commissions: tables, chairs, cabinets, and the myriad objects that filled Victorian interiors with the kind of dense material culture that transformed rooms into stage sets for daily life. Each piece was selected or commissioned to contribute to an overall aesthetic that balanced historical reference with contemporary comfort. The entrance hall received particular attention. Here, a marble plaque bore an inscription that would become one of Sandringham's defining texts. This house was built by Albert Edward, Prince of Wales, and Alexandra, his wife, in the year of our Lord 1870. The phrasing is precise and revealing, not commissioned or owned, but built, claiming active participation in creation. The prince's name comes first, following patriarchal convention, but Alexandra's inclusion acknowledges her role in what was framed as a joint domestic enterprise. The date, rendered as the year of our Lord 1870, roots the building in Christian chronology and gestures toward permanence through religious association. Technical systems incorporated modern conveniences while remaining mostly invisible. Hot water circulated through pipes to bathrooms and washing facilities. Gas lighting, supplied from the estate's own gasworks, illuminated rooms throughout the house. Plumbing brought running water to multiple floors. Heating came from numerous fireplaces supplemented by hot air systems. These technologies, advanced for 1870, were integrated into architecture that deliberately evoked earlier centuries. Victorian modernity concealed behind historical costume. The clock tower, which would later acquire memorial significance, initially served practical purposes. Its mechanism regulated the household's daily rhythms, marking the hours that structured Sandringham life: breakfast, shooting departure, lunch, tea, dressing for dinner, and the carefully timed progression of social rituals that defined country house existence. From the beginning, this clock kept Sandringham time, set half an hour ahead of Greenwich Mean Time to extend winter daylight for shooting, a peculiarity that transformed the estate into a temporal island operating on its own calculated schedule. Gardens surrounding the new house were laid out in concert with the architecture. Formal beds near the building gave way to parkland and woodland beyond, with views carefully composed to create picturesque prospects from principal windows. Lakes were expanded, and their edges shaped to enhance reflections and create the kind of naturalistic water features that Victorian landscape design favored. Planting included specimen trees that would take decades to reach maturity, an investment in long-term visual effects that assumed Sandringham would endure long enough for the designer's vision to be fulfilled. Contemporary descriptions of the completed house emphasize both its modernity and its traditional appearance. The Norfolk News called it a princely residence combining every modern convenience with the architectural character of an old English manor house, a phrase that captures Victorian aspirations to merge technological progress with historical continuity. This synthesis defined Sandringham's architectural identity: comfort achieved through modern engineering, aesthetic legitimacy claimed through historical association. By the end of 1870, the transformation was complete. What had been a modest Georgian hall on 8,000 acres was now a substantial Victorian mansion on a 20,000-acre estate. The new house announced royal presence through architectural scale while maintaining the language of domestic retreat. Its red brick glowed in Norfolk light, its chimneys drew smoke from dozens of hearths, and the clock tower kept time according to the household's adjusted calculations. Press coverage noted the completion with respectful interest. The Illustrated London News published engravings showing the house's irregular skyline and the covered entrance where carriages delivered visitors. Society columns mentioned upcoming shooting parties and speculated about which members of the aristocracy and diplomatic corps would be entertained in the new saloon. Sandringham had achieved what Albert Edward intended: architectural expression adequate to his current status and future expectations. Yet even as plasterers applied final coats and decorators hung the last curtains, correspondence reveals the prince privately noting that the house, though vastly improved, remained somewhat smaller than ideal for the entertaining he envisioned. The pattern established with the original hall was already repeating. Residents generated requirements, requirements demanded modifications, and architecture that seemed fixed in brick and stone would prove endlessly subject to adjustment. In photographs from late 1870, the new Sandringham stands complete, its windows reflecting winter sky, its walls unmarked by time. The camera captures architecture at its moment of completion. Before use begins the slow process of alteration, before rooms acquire the patina of occupation, before the building starts accumulating the human stories that will eventually matter more than bricks and mortar. The house was finished, but its transformation had only begun. Throughout the 1870s and into the early 1880s, Sandringham evolved from a newly completed residence into what contemporary observers began calling a model estate. This designation carried specific meaning in Victorian Britain. It described rural properties where landowners invested systematically in infrastructure, tenant housing, and agricultural improvement as demonstrations of enlightened management. For Albert Edward, presenting Sandringham as such an estate served multiple purposes. It justified the enormous expenditure on what was technically private property, suggested responsible stewardship appropriate to a future monarch, and provided favorable contrast to criticism of his social lifestyle. Estate pamphlets printed in 1884 for limited circulation documented these investments with the thoroughness of an agricultural reform manifesto. New roads had been constructed connecting tenant farms to market towns, reducing the cost and difficulty of moving crops and livestock. Cottages were built or substantially renovated to standards that exceeded typical rural housing, slate roofs replacing thatch, proper chimneys eliminating smoky interiors, and sanitation systems that brought Sandringham's tenant accommodations closer to urban middle-class norms than to traditional labor housing. Drainage projects received particular attention and investment. Norfolk's sandy soil could be highly productive when properly managed, but wet areas required systematic drainage to become agriculturally useful. Estate records show expenditure on tile drains, ditches, and the kind of land engineering that transformed boggy corners into productive fields. These improvements were presented not as charity, but as sound business practice. Evidence that large landholdings, properly managed, could benefit both owner and tenant while preserving traditional rural social structures against industrial disruption. The agricultural dimension of Sandringham was real, if secondary to its role as royal retreat and sporting estate. Tenant farmers worked the land under agreements that balanced customary practice with Victorian notions of improvement. Crop yields recorded in estate ledgers showed the effects of drainage investment and access to better equipment. Barley, wheat, and root vegetables grew in rotation, their cultivation following patterns common to Norfolk agriculture. The estate's farming operations functioned as legitimate agricultural enterprise, not merely as backdrop for aristocratic leisure. Yet these same agricultural records also reveal inherent tensions. Game preservation, the systematic breeding and protection of pheasant and partridge for shooting, operated at cross purposes with productive farming. The conflict found its most detailed documentation in Louisa Mary Cresswell's 1887 memoir, 18 Years on Sandringham Estate, written from the perspective of a tenant farmer whose family worked estate land throughout the 1870s and early 1880s. Cresswell's account describes daily reality of farming where game birds enjoyed greater protection than crops. Pheasants, bred in enormous numbers for the prince's shooting parties, ranged freely through fields, destroying grain and vegetable gardens. Estate rules absolutely prohibited tenants from killing or even seriously disturbing these birds regardless of damage inflicted. Farmers watched their work consumed by creatures they could not touch, protected by regulations enforced through tenancy agreements that made violation grounds for eviction. In compensation, the estate paid game damages, annual cash settlements calculated based on assessments of crop loss. Estate account books preserve these payments as line items, financial acknowledgement of a system where agriculture served sporting priorities. Cresswell's memoir reveals the mathematics of this arrangement. Compensation never quite matched actual losses, and the system placed burden of proof on tenants who had to document damage while carefully avoiding any action that might be construed as interference with game. The architectural expansion of Sandringham during this period reflected the estate's growing complexity. In 1883, Colonel R.W. Edis, by now the house's principal architect, designed substantial additions that would significantly increase capacity while maintaining stylistic consistency with Humbert's original work. The additions included a bachelor's wing to accommodate unmarried male guests, a billiard room sized for serious play, and a bowling alley converted from Toulon's earlier conservatory. Each addition served specific functions in the machinery of royal hospitality. The bachelor's wing housed aristocratic and diplomatic guests whose visits were framed as casual country weekends, but functioned as venues for political conversation and alliance building. Placing unmarried men in separate quarters followed Victorian propriety, while also creating spaces for the kind of late-night socializing that occurred away from family areas. The billiard room provided after-dinner entertainment and informal gathering space where discussions continued beyond the dining table. The bowling alley offered recreation appropriate to Victorian notions of healthful sport, though it would see far less use than the shooting that defined Sandringham's reputation. Edis's architectural approach maintained the red brick Jacobethan aesthetic established by Humbert, creating the impression of a house that had grown organically over time rather than being assembled in discrete campaigns across 15 years. Gables matched existing roof lines, windows repeated established proportions, and stone dressings continued the palette of Ketton limestone against red brick. The result was architectural unity that disguised chronological discontinuity, a building that looked as if it had always existed in its current form. Beyond the house, infrastructure continued expanding. The Appleton Water Tower, erected in 1877, stood at the highest point on the estate, a tall brick structure housing steam pumps and storage tanks that supplied running water under pressure to the house and estate buildings. Engineering drawings preserved in estate records show a sophisticated system for its time. Underground pipes distributed water across distances that previously required manual labor, and pressure allowed water to reach upper floors and supply fountains in formal gardens. This hydraulic network represented the kind of invisible infrastructure that made visible comfort possible. Hot baths, flush toilets, and garden fountains all depended on Victorian engineering hidden beneath Norfolk soil. The water tower itself became a landmark, visible from various points on the estate, a vertical assertion of technological modernity rising from flat landscape, its practical function wrapped in architectural costume that matched the house's historical styling. The estate's most visible activity remained shooting, and the 1880s saw this develop into something approaching industrial scale. Game books from the decade record annual bags rising steadily from the already substantial figures of the 1870s. By the mid-1880s, seasonal totals exceeded 20,000 pheasant and partridge, numbers that required systematic game management, professional gamekeepers, and the organized drives that transformed hunting into choreographed spectacle. The game larder, designed on the model of Holcombe Hall's celebrated facility, processed this harvest with mechanical efficiency. Architectural plans show a utilitarian structure built for its function, stone floors that could be hosed clean, thick walls maintaining stable temperature, and racks for hanging hundreds of carcasses simultaneously. Birds shot in morning drives were processed by afternoon, their carcasses prepared for distribution to the house, estate cottages, and London markets. This building, hidden in the service zone behind walls and hedges, represented essential architecture for Sandringham's primary leisure activity, the infrastructure of systematic killing. Contemporary sporting journals praised Sandringham's organization, describing shooting days where everything proceeded with the precision of military operations. Beaters moved through coverts on schedule, pushing birds toward guns positioned at numbered stands. Loaders handled weapons with practiced efficiency, allowing continuous fire. Servants collected fallen birds between drives, maintaining count and ensuring nothing was wasted. The entire operation demonstrated organizational capacity as much as marksmanship, proof that rational management could be applied to sport as effectively as to agriculture or industry. The clock tower maintained its peculiar relationship with time throughout this period. All Sandringham clocks remained set half an hour ahead of Greenwich Mean Time, extending winter afternoons and allowing shooting to continue longer into twilight. This practice, now more than a decade old, had become one of the estate's defining characteristics, evidence of the place's singular nature and the prince's willingness to bend even objective phenomena like solar time to serve sporting convenience. Queen Victoria, during her occasional visits, continued to insist that clocks in her rooms be reset to proper Greenwich time. She characterized the practice in her journal as a wicked lie, applying moral language typically reserved for serious transgressions. To the Queen, altering clocks represented claiming authority over truth itself, suggesting that even natural phenomena could be adjusted to serve personal preference. Her objection went beyond mere fastidiousness. It reflected Victorian conviction that time, like other fundamental truths, should not be subject to individual manipulation. The Prince of Wales, by all accounts, found his mother's insistence more amusing than persuasive. Sandringham clocks remained ahead, and the household operated on its adjusted schedule. Invitations to guests specified Sandringham time to avoid confusion, and railway schedules from King's Lynn noted the difference, creating a temporal bubble centered on a Norfolk country house where hours existed that could be found nowhere else in Britain. Estate staff expanded continually to manage this growing operation. Account books list wages paid to gamekeepers, gardeners, stable hands, house servants, and specialized workers required to maintain Victorian comfort, lamp cleaners, coal carriers, and staff responsible for the estate's gas lighting plant. By the mid-1880s, Sandringham employed hundreds of people, creating a community whose economic survival depended entirely on royal residence and its associated demands. The formal gardens continued developing under professional supervision. Specimen trees planted in the 1870s had matured enough to provide the framework of established parkland. The lakes, their edges carefully shaped and planted, reflected deliberate compositions of water, lawn, and woodland. Nature, edited to produce scenes of controlled beauty. These landscapes represented Victorian taste, applied to natural materials, transforming agricultural land into aesthetic statements that suggested the estate had existed in this refined form for generations. A newspaper profile from 1884, preserved in the Royal Archives, praised the Prince of Wales' stewardship and expressed hope that his example would inspire similar efforts by other landowners. The article coined the verb Sandringhamize to describe the transformation of estates through systematic improvement, a term that briefly entered reformist vocabulary before fading into obscurity. The coinage captured contemporary belief that exemplary individual action by wealthy landowners could address social problems without requiring structural economic change. Yet, beneath this narrative of benevolent improvement, contradictions accumulated that careful observers could not ignore. The model estate required enormous expenditure that few other landowners could match, investment possible only because of income from sources far beyond Norfolk's boundaries. Agricultural improvements coexisted uneasily with game preservation that demonstrably damaged crops, creating tensions that financial compensation addressed without resolving. Modern infrastructure served primarily the comfort of occupants who spent only portions of each year in residence, while tenant farmers lived year-round, with the consequences of priorities set in the big house. Photographs from the mid-1880s show Sandringham at apparent equilibrium, the house fully realized in its Victorian form, gardens maturing toward their designed appearance, and the estate operating as a complex machine for producing royal domestic life. These images capture architecture and landscape at their intended peak, before loss began accumulating in memorial stone, before the building's scale would be questioned and reduced, before the forces that would eventually transform the estate had gathered momentum. The clock tower, visible in these photographs as a vertical accent against Norfolk sky, still marked primarily practical time, the hours of shooting parties and dinner bells, not yet memorial time. Its mechanism turned, its bells struck adjusted hours, and the estate's routines unfolded according to schedules printed in leather-bound books kept in the house steward's office. Everything ran according to plan, as if sufficient planning could guarantee permanence. In the estate's game books, annual totals climbed steadily. In account ledgers, expenditures balanced against income from timber sales, tenant rents, and investments elsewhere. In the house itself, rooms filled with guests whose names appeared in Burke's peerage and the diplomatic list, evidence that Sandringham had achieved its purpose as a venue where the Prince of Wales could entertain those who mattered to Britain's political and social life. And in the gardens, photographers positioned their cameras to capture views, suggesting Sandringham had achieved the settled permanence of places that had stood for centuries, when the entire complex was barely 15 years old. The model estate represented Victorian confidence in rational improvement, belief that sufficient investment, organization, and systematic effort could perfect any system and make progress permanent. The architecture embodied this optimism in brick and stone, built to serve functions its creators assumed would remain relevant indefinitely. What neither architect nor patron could design against was the simple fact that all permanence is temporary, and models eventually become relics of the assumptions that created them. The peculiarity of Sandringham time represented more than mere convenience for extending shooting hours. By the 1890s, the estate's clocks had been running half an hour ahead of Greenwich for 2 decades, long enough that this temporal adjustment had become fundamental to Sandringham's identity, mentioned regularly in society columns and visitor accounts as evidence of the place's singular character. The practice originated in straightforward calculation. Winter daylight in Norfolk is brief, and shooting parties required maximum hours of usable light. Setting all estate clocks ahead effectively borrowed time from other activities to serve the guns. The clock tower embodied this manipulation through both its mechanism and its symbolic presence. Visible from the front drive and from paths through the park, it marked hours that existed nowhere else in Britain, a visible assertion that royal preference could override national standard. The Latin motto that would later be added, "Hora perunt et imputantur," commonly translated as "the hours perish and will be charged to our account," would acquire additional resonance in this context. Hours at Sandringham were not merely measured, but actively bent to serve the estate's central purpose. Game books from this period document the scale of that purpose with numerical precision. In the 1870s, annual shooting bags had ranged from 6,000 to 8,000 birds. By the 1890s, that figure routinely exceeded 20,000 pheasant and partridge killed per season, with individual days producing bags of more than 1,000 birds. Records itemize each day's results, noting weather conditions, names of guns present, and the specific drives where birds were flushed and shot. These ledgers read like accounting books, transforming mass death into administrative data, columns of figures measuring success in volume of kill. The infrastructure supporting this scale of hunting existed largely out of sight of guests. The game larder operated as an industrial processing facility where shot birds were received, hung under controlled temperature conditions, aged according to established protocols, and distributed on elaborate schedules. Stone floors allowed drainage and hosing. Thick walls maintained stable temperature even in summer, and racks held hundreds of carcasses simultaneously. Staff worked in shifts during heavy shooting days, processing birds as quickly as guns could kill them. Visitors to the house never saw this utilitarian structure, hidden behind service buildings, but it represented essential architecture for what Sandringham had become, a machine for producing aristocratic sport at unprecedented scale. The gunroom, by contrast, occupied prominent space near the main entrance, architectural acknowledgement that shooting was central rather than peripheral to Sandringham's identity. Estate photographs show walls lined with locked cabinets storing expensive weapons, tables for cleaning and maintenance, and decorative touches, prints of hunting scenes, mounted game birds, trophies that transformed functional space into gentleman's club. Here, before and after each day's shooting, Participants gathered to handle weapons, discuss strategies for upcoming drives, and maintain the social rituals that distinguished aristocratic sport from simple killing. The organized drives through Sandringham's coverts followed carefully plotted routes designed for maximum efficiency. Game managers had planted hedgerows to channel birds toward specific locations where guns waited at numbered stands arranged in carefully calculated positions. Beaters, estate workers, and local men hired for the season moved through woods on precise schedules, their coordinated noise and motion pushing pheasants and partridges toward the killing ground. Maps preserved in estate records show these routes with tactical precision, each drive numbered and annotated with notes about typical bird behavior, optimal wind conditions, and the positioning that produced best shooting. This choreography required extensive planning and military-style discipline. Written orders distributed before each shooting day specified timing, positioning, and procedures. Whistles signaled the Wadi Fama, start of drives. Flags marked positions where guns should stand. The entire operation demonstrated that rational organization could be applied to sport as effectively as to warfare or industry. That pleasure, pursued systematically, required the same disciplined coordination as any other complex enterprise. Estate accounts continued recording annual payments to tenant farmers for crop damage caused by protected game. These game damages entries acknowledged financial cost while carefully avoiding more fundamental questions about whose interests the estate ultimately served. The compensation system represented a compromise that allowed intensive game preservation and productive agriculture to coexist, however uneasily, on the same land. Farmers accepted payment rather than the right to control wildlife on land they worked but did not own, an arrangement that satisfied neither party completely but allowed both activities to continue. Louisa Cresswell's memoir, published in 1887 after her family had left the estate, provides the tenant perspective without the constraints of current economic dependence. She describes walking through fields where her family's crops had been damaged and calculating the difference between what grew and what might have grown without game consuming or trampling planted acreage. Her account avoids direct criticism. Even after leaving, she understood the risks of publicly antagonizing powerful figures. But the arithmetic speaks clearly. The compensation paid, she notes carefully, never quite covered actual losses, particularly when accounting for labor invested in crops that fed pheasants rather than reaching market. The scale of game preservation at Sandringham required accepting that substantial acreage would be sacrificed to maintain bird populations. Young pheasants raised in pens before release needed feeding until they could forage independently. Cover crops were planted specifically to provide shelter and food for game rather than for harvest. Predator control was pursued aggressively, with gamekeepers trapping or shooting any creature that might threaten pheasant populations. Foxes, stoats, weasels, hawks, and owls, all systematically eliminated to protect birds destined for royal guns. This ecological simplification produced landscapes optimized for single-species game management at the expense of biological diversity. Contemporary naturalists occasionally noted the absence of predatory birds and mammals from Sandringham's woods, though such observations rarely appeared in sporting journals that celebrated the estate's success. The Norfolk countryside was being reshaped to serve specific human purposes, its natural complexity reduced to support one particular form of leisure. Queen Victoria's continued objection to Sandringham time, her insistence that clocks in her rooms be set to Greenwich during visits, represented more than chronometric fastidiousness. Her characterization of the practice as a wicked lie invoked moral language suggesting genuine offense. To alter clocks was to claim authority over objective truth, suggesting that even natural phenomena like solar time could be adjusted to serve convenience. The Queen's Victorian sense of propriety recoiled from this casual manipulation of what should be fixed and certain. The Prince of Wales apparently found his mother's position more endearing than persuasive. Sandringham clocks remained ahead throughout his residence, and the household continued operating on its adjusted schedule. The temporal peculiarity had become so established that changing it would have felt like abandoning part of Sandringham's distinctive identity. Estate time was Sandringham time, and the rest of Britain would simply have to adjust when visiting Norfolk. This temporal manipulation paralleled other ways the estate reshaped natural and social systems to serve its purposes. Game preservation altered ecology in favor of desired species. Agricultural practice bent to accommodate shooting schedules and preserve cover for birds. Social relationships throughout the estate's villages reflected economic dependence on royal patronage, creating communities whose prosperity required deference to priorities set in the big house. Time, nature, and human society were all adjusted to serve a vision of aristocratic leisure that assumed its own priorities as natural and proper ordering of rural life. The clock tower presided over all this as both practical instrument and symbolic statement. Its mechanism kept the adjusted time that governed estate rhythms: breakfast at stated hours, meaning half an hour earlier by Greenwich, lunch coordinating with shooting schedules, tea providing afternoon break, dinner time to allow maximum daylight activity. Its bells marked these moments audibly, sound carrying across parkland and into cottages where estate workers learned to translate Sandringham chimes into actual hours when coordinating with the world beyond the estate's boundaries. Press coverage from the 1890s describes Sandringham as exemplifying modern country house life at its finest, sport organized to perfection, hospitality legendary, agricultural improvement demonstrating enlightened land ownership. These accounts rarely examined the human labor making such perfection possible, the ecological simplification required to produce 20,000 birds annually, or the financial subsidies flowing from investments and properties far from Norfolk that funded an operation no estate could sustain through agricultural income alone. Photographs from this period show shooting parties posed with the day's bag, rows of dead birds laid out on gravel in careful arrangement, while guns stand behind in tweeds and gaiters, their expressions combining satisfaction with the studied nonchalance appropriate to gentlemen for whom this represented leisure rather than labor. These images circulated in sporting journals and society publications, documenting accomplishment through accumulation. The largest bags became newsworthy, with press noting when records fell and speculating about future attempts to exceed them. Individual shooting prowess was celebrated, but the system producing these opportunities remained largely invisible in published accounts. Readers saw impressive totals without necessarily considering the years of habitat management, the teams of gamekeepers, the intensive breeding programs, and the small army of beaters whose coordinated labor made possible the appearance of effortless aristocratic sport. The architecture of killing, both literal structures like the game larder and the organizational systems making mass hunting possible, operated backstage while public attention focused on the performance itself. As the 19th century ended, Sandringham had perfected a particular vision of aristocratic rural life: sport organized for maximum success, domestic comfort engineered to eliminate inconvenience, and time itself adjusted to serve pleasure. The architecture housing this vision combined Victorian modernity with historical styling, modern plumbing behind Jacobethan gables, gas lighting in paneled rooms, steam-powered pumps supplying pressure water to buildings designed to evoke earlier centuries. It was synthesis meant to suggest permanence through association with the past while enabling comfort through present-day technology. The clock tower kept ticking ahead of Greenwich, each chime arriving 30 minutes before it would anywhere else in Britain. The hours were perishing, though at Sandringham they perished on a schedule set by royal preference, borrowed time extending days until darkness made further shooting impossible, and guests moved indoors to rooms lit by gas and warmed by coal fires, where time resumed its normal pace in social rituals that stretched evening into night. The expansion of 1884 brought the ballroom, a space that solved a problem that had troubled Alexandra since moving into the new house. The saloon, designed to serve simultaneously as entrance hall and principal living room, had to be substantially rearranged whenever large entertainments required dancing space. Furniture was moved, carpets rolled up, and the room transformed from domestic space to performance venue, a process that disrupted household routine and limited the spontaneity with which entertainments could be planned. The new ballroom, designed by Colonel R.W. Edis, addressed this by creating dedicated space for formal entertaining. The room occupied a new wing extending from the main house, connected by corridors but separated enough to allow preparation for events without disturbing family areas. Architectural drawings show a rectangular space with high ceilings supported by decorated beams, tall windows providing natural light, and a musician's gallery elevated at one end. The scale was substantial but not overwhelming. This was a room designed for house parties of 50 or 100 guests, not the immense state balls held in London palaces. Queen Alexandra's reaction survives in correspondence preserved in the royal archives. She wrote with evident satisfaction that, "Our new ballroom is beautiful, I think, and a great success, and avoids pulling the hall to pieces each time there is a ball or anything." The phrase anything captures the room's intended flexibility. It would serve not only for dancing, but for theatrical performances, musical entertainments, and the varied social activities that filled country house weekends. The ballroom represented architectural acknowledgement that Sandringham's social functions had outgrown the spaces provided in Humbert's original design. The room's decoration reflected late Victorian taste for richness and complexity. The ceiling received painted ornament in colors that contemporary descriptions characterize as harmonious and refined, coded language for the kind of restrained elaboration that distinguished aristocratic taste from the garish excess associated with new industrial wealth. Plasterwork around the musician's gallery incorporated heraldic devices connecting the space to royal identity without overwhelming the room's function as venue for entertainment. Estate inventories from the late 1880s cataloged the ballroom's furnishings: chairs and settees arranged along walls, side tables for refreshments, and the decorative objects, vases, sculpture, potted plants, that softened the room's formality when not in use for events. Between entertainments, the space served as additional reception room, its scale accommodating gatherings too large for the drawing room, but not requiring the full apparatus of a ball. The drawing room itself, described by architectural historian as the nearest Sandringham gets to pomp, had evolved into a showcase of Alexandra's taste and the accumulated objects of royal life. Country life photographs from this period show walls densely hung with portraits, Alexandra and her daughters depicted in formal poses and more intimate family scenes. White marble statuary occupied alcoves and corners, classical figures providing visual counterpoint to painted portraits. Twin fireplaces, positioned on opposite walls, anchored the room's symmetry while providing practical heating for a space whose large windows and high ceilings made warmth difficult to maintain in Norfolk winters. Queen Victoria's journal, recording her visits to Sandringham, describes these fireplaces specifically, noting their ornate surrounds and the arrangement of furniture that drew guests toward their warmth. The Queen's attention to such details reflected her own interest in domestic architecture and her approval of how her son and daughter-in-law had furnished their country house. Despite her concerns about Albert Edward's social life and financial management, Victoria expressed satisfaction with Sandringham itself. The building and its contents met her standards for how royalty should live when in the country. The saloon, meanwhile, had been refined through accumulated decoration into something approaching a private museum. Hunting trophies mounted on walls documented the prince's shooting accomplishments. Family photographs in silver frames covered tabletops and sideboards, creating visual archives of royal connections and dynastic relationships. Paintings acquired from London dealers hung in careful arrangement, their subjects ranging from landscapes to portraits to the kind of genre scenes that appealed to Victorian domestic sensibility. This layering of objects transformed rooms from architectural spaces into repositories of meaning. Each item carried associations: a particular shooting trip, a family visit, a diplomatic exchange. Guests moving through these spaces encountered not merely decoration, but evidence of the lives lived here, the relationships maintained, the history accumulated. The house was becoming more than building. It was developing into archive of experience encoded in material objects. When Queen Victoria visited in November 1889, Sandringham demonstrated its capacity to serve as venue for culture as well as sport. The occasion was a private theatrical performance by two of the era's most celebrated actors, Sir Henry Irving and Ellen Terry, who performed in the new ballroom before an audience limited to the Queen, the Prince and Princess of Wales, and invited guests. Press accounts described the event as evidence of Sandringham's versatility, a country house that could accommodate both sporting pursuits and serious artistic performance. The choice of performers reflected the Prince of Wales's interest in theatre and his cultivation of relationships with leading figures from London's artistic world. Irving and Terry represented theatrical legitimacy, actors whose reputations placed them beyond the moral suspicion that clung to theatre in earlier generations. Having them perform at Sandringham suggested that the house functioned as cultural center, not merely as shooting lodge. It was part of Albert Edward's broader effort to position himself as patron of arts and modern cultural figure, not just traditional sporting aristocrat. The performance itself took place on a temporary stage erected in the ballroom, with audience seating arranged to provide clear sightlines. Stage lighting came from portable gas fixtures supplemented by oil lamps, creating theatrical atmosphere in a room designed for dancing. The technological adaptation required careful planning. Fire risk from open flames in a wooden-ceilinged room demanded precautions, and ventilation had to be managed to prevent dangerous accumulation of gas fumes. Contemporary accounts emphasize the intimacy of the occasion, a performance for an audience of perhaps 30 or 40 people in a space that could hold 10 times that number. This scale allowed appreciation of the actor's craft in ways impossible in large commercial theaters. The Queen's presence lent the event official significance, royal endorsement of both the performers and the kind of cultural activity they represented. The clock tower appeared in society reports and illustrated press accounts of this period as part of Sandringham's visual identity, a vertical element in engravings and photographs that helped readers recognize the location. Its architectural function was primarily aesthetic, providing the kind of picturesque skyline variation that Victorian design valued. But its mechanism continued serving practical purposes, regulating daily rhythms and maintaining the half-hour temporal offset that distinguished Sandringham time from the rest of Britain. At night, when guests departed the ballroom after theatrical performances or balls, they would see the clock tower illuminated against dark Norfolk sky, its face still visible and its mechanism still advancing through hours that existed nowhere else. The site became part of Sandringham's distinctive character, evidence of a place operating according to its own rules, where even time bent to serve royal preference. The architectural additions of the 1880s represented the house reaching mature form. Further modifications would come. Sandringham would never stop adapting, but the major functional spaces were now in place. The building could accommodate the full range of activities expected of a great country house: family life in private wings, guest accommodation in separate quarters, entertaining in dedicated social spaces, and service functions in extensive back-of-house areas. The architecture had caught up with the uses demanded of it, creating spatial framework for the life the Prince of Wales wanted to lead. Press descriptions from the late 1880s characterized Sandringham as a palace of domestic ease, a phrase that captures the synthesis the house had achieved. It was palatial in scale and appointment, suggesting status and wealth. Yet it was also domestic, maintaining the language and feeling of family residence rather than institutional formality. And it was easy, equipped with modern conveniences that eliminated the physical discomforts associated with older country houses. This combination represented Victorian ideal: hierarchy and comfort coexisting, tradition and modernity reconciled through careful architectural and decorative choices. The phrase domestic ease also suggested a particular vision of monarchy: accessible, comfortable, modern, while respecting tradition. This was the image Albert Edward cultivated at Sandringham: a prince who lived like a very wealthy gentleman, whose house was grand but not forbidding, whose lifestyle blended sport, culture, and sociability in proportions that suggested both energy and refinement. Whether this image matched reality is debatable, but architecturally it was being expressed successfully. Yet, even in these years of apparent completion, when the house seemed to have reached stable form and function, elements were accumulating that would transform Sandringham's meaning. The clock tower, built to regulate shooting schedules and dinner times, would soon receive its memorial inscription: Rooms designed for pleasure would become stages for grief, and the architecture that expressed confidence in permanence would begin the slow accumulation of loss that eventually redefines every building that lasts long enough to outlive its creator's intentions. For now, though, the ballroom hosted dancers, the drawing room received admiring descriptions in society journals, and the saloon gathered guests around its fireplaces, while outside the clock tower measured hours that seemed to stretch endlessly forward into a future that looked much like the present, prosperous, secure, and permanent. With Edward VII's succession in January 1901, following Queen Victoria's death, Sandringham's role shifted fundamentally. What had been the private country retreat of a Prince of Wales became the preferred residence of a reigning monarch. The distinction mattered. While Albert Edward could treat Sandringham as personal property for private use, Edward VII's presence transformed any location into royal court, with implications for staffing, security, protocol, and public perception. The king's attachment to Sandringham was deep and genuine. He had spent 40 years shaping the estate to his preferences, and unlike the palaces held in trust for the crown, Sandringham was freehold property, his to modify, manage, and eventually bequeath as he chose. This ownership gave the estate particular significance in his life. Elsewhere, he was monarch occupying state properties. At Sandringham, he was landowner on his own land, a distinction he clearly valued. The house's 20,000-acre estate became visible in new ways during Edward VII's reign. Postcards and illustrated magazines depicted Sandringham's formal gardens and lakes with the kind of romantic visual language previously reserved for ancient castles and historic estates. The images emphasized picturesque qualities: water reflecting sky, specimen trees framing views, carefully maintained grounds suggesting natural beauty enhanced by gentle human intervention. These photographs and engravings circulated widely, making Sandringham familiar to British subjects who would never visit Norfolk, but could purchase penny postcards showing where their king spent his private time. The gardens themselves had matured significantly since the 1870s. Trees planted 30 years earlier had reached substantial size, creating the layered canopy and dappled shade that Victorian landscape design sought to achieve. The lakes, their edges shaped and planted in the 1880s, now appeared entirely natural, evidence of successful landscape architecture that concealed its own artifice. Paths wound through woodland and along water, offering a sequence of composed views that made walking the grounds an aesthetic experience as well as physical exercise. St. Mary Magdalene Church, the estate's parish church, acquired particular significance during this period. The building itself dated from the 16th century, a perpendicular-style structure that had served the village long before royal ownership. Its position, nobly lying on raised ground, as one contemporary description phrased it, gave it visual prominence in the landscape. The church was small, a single nave with no side aisles, but its interior had been enriched through royal patronage. Queen Alexandra had donated extensively to the church's furnishing and decoration. Norwegian wood carving, reflecting her Danish background and Scandinavian aesthetic preferences, adorned the chancel. A silver altar and pulpit, gifts from Alexandra, transformed the simple Norfolk church interior into something approaching the richness of a private chapel. These donations represented personal devotion expressed through material patronage. The Queen, quite literally leaving her mark on the sacred space nearest to her country home. The royal family's attendance at Sunday services became a predictable element of Sandringham life, and when the king was in residence, these occasions drew public interest. Local people and visitors would gather to watch the short procession from house to church, a rare opportunity to see the monarch in the context of ordinary religious observance. Press accounts described these walks as evidence of the king's accessibility and his participation in normal parish life, though the presence of security and the attention of observers somewhat contradicted claims of normalcy. Beyond the house and immediate grounds, the estate's infrastructure continued expanding. New cottages for estate workers, built to the improved standards established in earlier decades, demonstrated ongoing investment in the physical fabric of the community. A school, a rectory, and staff facilities, including the Babingley Clubhouse, provided services and social space for the workforce required to maintain a great estate. These buildings represented the same model estate philosophy that had guided development in the 1880s, the idea that enlightened landowners should provide not just employment, but comprehensive social infrastructure. Contemporary newspaper commentary praised this investment, with one article expressing hope to Sandringhamize Marlborough House to apply the same principles of active, engaged proprietorship to other royal properties. The phrase appeared in press coverage describing Edward VII as exemplifying landlord, agriculturist, and country gentleman all at once, roles that the article suggested should be emulated by others with similar resources and responsibilities. This public narrative of model estate management coexisted with the continued reality of Sandringham as sporting estate. Shooting parties remained central to the house's purpose, and gamebook totals continued climbing. The infrastructure of game preservation, breeding pens, gamekeepers' cottages, the game larder, operated as efficiently as ever. The tension between agricultural improvement and game preservation that Louisa Cresswell had documented persisted, managed through the same compensation system that acknowledged conflict without resolving it. The clock tower appeared in early 20th century postcards and press photographs as a visual identifier of Sandringham, its distinctive silhouette helping readers recognize the location. These images typically emphasize the tower against sky, or as part of a composed view showing the house's irregular roofline. The tower functioned as architectural shorthand for the entire estate, much as Big Ben represented Parliament or the Eiffel Tower represented Paris, a singular element standing for a complex whole. Sandringham time continued throughout Edward VII's reign. The king saw no reason to abandon the practice his mother had objected to so strenuously. The estate's clocks remained set half an hour ahead of Greenwich, extending winter daylight and maintaining the temporal peculiarity that had become part of Sandringham's identity. Visitors learned to adjust, railway schedules accommodated the difference, and the practice continued as living reminder of royal prerogative to organize even time according to preference. The estate's organic farmland and livestock operations provided genuine agricultural productivity alongside the sporting activities. Modern and heritage grain varieties grew in rotation, their cultivation following contemporary best practices. Flocks of sheep grazed parkland and rougher pasture, unsuitable for cultivation. The estate functioned as working agricultural enterprise, not merely as backdrop for leisure, though the priorities remained clear. Shooting took precedence over farming when the two came into conflict. Edward VII's reign transformed how Britain saw Sandringham. What had been a relatively private retreat of the Prince of Wales became a public symbol of how monarchy chose to live in the 20th century. The house represented continuity with Victorian tradition while suggesting openness to modernity. Its architecture evoked historical England while incorporating contemporary convenience. Its estate management combined traditional hierarchy with progressive social investment. These contradictions coexisted because the house was large and complex enough to accommodate multiple meanings simultaneously. The king's death in 1910, though it occurred at Buckingham Palace rather than Sandringham, marked the end of an era for the Norfolk estate. He had shaped the place over nearly 50 years, from the demolition of the original hall through successive expansions to the mature establishment of the early 20th century. Every building, path, and planting decision bore his influence. Sandringham was Edward VII's creation in ways that other royal residences were not, and his death meant the estate would now pass to George V, whose relationship with the place would necessarily be different. The clock tower that had marked Edward VII's adjusted hours would continue keeping Sandringham time under the new reign, but changes were coming. The stable Edwardian world that Sandringham represented was approaching its end, though few in 1910 could have predicted how thoroughly the coming decades would transform both the estate and the society that created it. On 14th of January 1892, 18 years before Edward VII's accession, Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence and Avondale, died at Sandringham House. He was 28 years old, eldest son of the Prince and Princess of Wales, and second in line to the throne after his father. His death from pneumonia, following a brief illness during an influenza epidemic, shocked the royal family and the nation. He died in one of the house's upper bedrooms, the illness progressing rapidly despite medical attention. Within 6 days, the heir to the heir was gone. Contemporary accounts describe the household's grief in the elaborate language of Victorian mourning. Black crape draped the house's entrance, windows were shuttered, and the normal routines of country house life stopped entirely. Alexandra was devastated. Albert Victor was her eldest child, and his death came suddenly enough that the family had little time to prepare. Photographs from this period show the house in mourning, its visual transformation from site of pleasure to site of loss, captured in the temporary architecture of grief, black fabric, drawn curtains, and the visible markers of death in a great house. To commemorate him, a clock tower was erected, or more accurately, the existing clock tower received a memorial inscription and was formally dedicated to his memory. The Latin text carved into the tower read, "Hora pereunt et imputantur," a phrase whose standard translation is, "The hours perish and will be charged to our account." Some sources render it as, "The hours perish and are laid to our charge," slight variations that preserve the essential meaning. Time passes irretrievably, and we are accountable for how we use it. This inscription transformed the clock tower from practical instrument to memorial object. The tower that had regulated shooting schedules and adjusted hours for convenience now carried theological weight. Each chime became a reminder of mortality, each passing hour evidence of time's irreversible flow toward death. The tower that had embodied temporal manipulation, the audacious claim that royal preference could set clocks ahead, now bore inscription insisting on time's ultimate authority over human life. The phrase, "the hours perish," carries particular resonance in context of Sandringham time. For decades, the estate had operated on the fiction that hours could be borrowed, that setting clocks ahead could literally extend days. The memorial inscription effectively refuted this claim. Hours perish regardless of how clocks are set. And the account comes due regardless of human attempts to manipulate measurement. The theological dimension matters as well. The phrase implies divine judgment. Hours will be charged to our account, suggests a reckoning, an accountability before ultimate authority. This religious language was entirely conventional for Victorian memorial inscriptions, but at Sandringham it acquired specific meaning. A house devoted to pleasure, where thousands of birds died annually for sport, where time itself was adjusted to maximize enjoyment, now bore permanent reminder that pleasure exists within framework of mortality and divine accounting. Photographs and engravings from the late 1890s and early 1900s show the clock tower with increasing frequency, its memorial significance making it notable subject for images documenting Sandringham. The tower appears in postcards, in illustrated magazine articles, and in the kind of amateur photographs that estate visitors made as souvenirs. Its silhouette became inseparable from Sandringham's visual identity, the vertical element that anchored compositions showing the house and grounds. In family photographs from this period, the tower appears in backgrounds, often accidentally, simply part of the architecture visible from positions where cameras were set up for formal group portraits. These inadvertent appearances are perhaps more revealing than deliberate memorial photographs. The tower had become such an established element of Sandringham's landscape that its presence went unremarked even as its inscription insisted on being noticed. The memorial represented architectural acknowledgement that dynastic plans could be undone by chance. Albert Victor had been groomed for kingship, educated and positioned for the role he would assume after his father. His death disrupted that succession, moving his younger brother George into position as heir. This shift had profound consequences for British history. George V would be a very different monarch than Albert Victor might have been. But in 1892, the immediate impact was grief, and the architectural response was memorial stone. Contemporary mourning culture demanded such markers. Death required material commemoration, particularly death in prominent families. But the choice to memorialize Albert Victor through the clock tower rather than through a separate monument or chapel was specific to Sandringham's circumstances. The tower already existed as prominent architectural feature. Adding inscription transformed existing structure rather than creating new one. This pragmatic approach also ensured the memorial would be integrated into daily life rather than sequestered in separate space, visited only for mourning. The inscription's placement meant that anyone consulting the clock for practical purposes, checking time before departing for shooting, glancing up during a walk through the grounds, encountered reminder of mortality. The tower could not be used for its original, practical function without simultaneously serving its memorial function. This layering of meaning represented Victorian design thinking at its most characteristic. Objects should carry multiple significances, should work simultaneously on practical and symbolic levels. Estate life continued after Albert Victor's death, as estate life must. Shooting parties resumed, guests returned, and the machinery of aristocratic leisure operated as before. But the memorial inscription remained, permanent reminder that beneath the surface of pleasure ran currents of loss. Every subsequent death at Sandringham, and there would be more, including 2 kings, occurred in the shadow of that first dynastic loss and the clock tower that commemorated it. The tower's bells, ringing out hours ahead of Greenwich time, now carried doubled meaning. They marked the adjusted time that enabled extended shooting days, and they simultaneously reminded hearers that all hours, whether measured accurately or manipulated, perish and will be charged to account. The contradiction was not resolved, it simply coexisted, 2 truths about time existing simultaneously in the same architectural element. For Alexandra, the memorial tower represented public acknowledgement of private grief. She had lost her eldest son in a house that was supposed to be refuge and protection, Norfolk retreat from dangers of city and court. The inscription she saw daily from windows and paths was both comfort and wound, evidence that Albert Victor's life was memorialized and constant reminder of his absence. When Edward VII died in 1910, and when George V eventually died at Sandringham in 1936, the clock tower built to memorialize one death stood witness to others. The pattern established with Albert Victor's memorial would repeat. Royal deaths at Sandringham would leave marks on the place, accumulating layers of loss that gradually redefined what the house meant. Built as stage for pleasure, it was becoming repository of grief, the architectural container for a family's recurring experience of mortality. The inscription, "The hours perish and will be charged to our account," became, over time, Sandringham's epitaph in advance, a statement of what all architecture eventually faces. Buildings are constructed to defy time, to establish permanence against change, to house human purposes across generations. But time perishes buildings as surely as it perishes people, and eventually all accounts come due. The clock tower, built to mark time and then to memorialize one death, would outlast much of the house it adorned, surviving modifications and reductions that would erase rooms, wings, and entire sections of the building it helped identify. During the First World War, Sandringham Estate contributed to Britain's military effort in a way that would leave permanent memorial mark on the landscape. A territorial unit known as the King's Own Sandringham Company, officially part of the 5th Battalion of the Royal Side-de-Pau Norfolk Regiment, was formed largely from estate workers, gamekeepers, gardeners, farm laborers, and domestic staff who enlisted together under local leadership. This was not unusual. Many great estates raised similar companies in the early months of the war, when patriotic enthusiasm and traditional deference to landowners combined to create locally recruited military units. The company trained together, departed together, and in August 1915 arrived at Gallipoli as part of the disastrous campaign to force passage through the Dardanelles and knock Ottoman Turkey out of the war. On 12th August, during the Battle of Suvla Bay, the Sandringham Company advanced into action and effectively disappeared. Almost all of its members were killed or listed as missing, their bodies never recovered or identified. The exact circumstances remained unclear. Reports mentioned confusion in the advance, heavy fire from Turkish positions, and the chaos typical of the Gallipoli campaign's incompetent management. The disappearance entered public imagination as one of the war's mysterious tragedies. Various theories circulated, some suggesting the company had been cut off and captured, others proposing they had advanced too far and been destroyed in isolated position. The lack of bodies or definite information allowed speculation to flourish. In reality, the explanation was grimly simple. The men had been killed in combat, and their remains were never recovered from the difficult terrain where they fell. A memorial was later erected on the Sandringham estate to commemorate the company's service and loss. The monument stands as one of many war memorials scattered across British estates, villages, and cities, stone testimony to the generation destroyed between 1914 and 1918. But the Sandringham Memorial carried particular weight because of its connection to royal estate and because the company's composition, drawn largely from estate workers, created direct line from the big house to the casualty lists. The camera traces connections from estate cottages and workshops to names carved on memorial stone, set against views of the big house that had changed little despite the war. The juxtaposition is stark, the architecture of aristocratic leisure persisting while the men who maintained it died on distant shores. This contrast was not unique to Sandringham. Every great estate faced similar reality during the war, but the visibility of royal connection made the loss particularly notable in public consciousness. Contemporary newspaper coverage, particularly after George V's own death decades later, frequently described him as more than a king, a father of a great family. The phrase, though written in 1936, resonated with the earlier loss of estate workers during the war. The paternal relationship between landowner and workers had been real enough in economic terms. Employment, housing, and community life all depended on the estate. But paternalism proved inadequate. Protection against industrial warfare that consumed men regardless of whose family they belonged to or whose land they worked. The war memorial stood at the edge of the park, positioned to be visible from public paths, but not intruding on private views from the house. This spatial arrangement was typical. Memorials acknowledged loss while being careful not to disrupt the aesthetic and functional priorities of landscapes designed for other purposes. The names carved in stone represented men who had worked in buildings and fields still visible beyond the memorial, gardeners whose gardens still grew, gamekeepers whose coverts still produced game, domestic servants whose work continued being performed by others. The clock tower, built to memorialize one dynastic death, now existed in landscape that also commemorated mass death of working men. The two memorials operated on different scales and addressed different kinds of loss, but both reminded viewers of mortality and sacrifice. One marked private royal grief, the other collective community loss. Together they suggested that Sandringham had become a place where death was architecturally acknowledged, where mortality had permanent markers in stone and inscription. The film, All the King's Men, produced decades later, dramatized the Sandringham Company's story, bringing wider attention to a loss that might otherwise have faded into the general casualties of a disastrous campaign. The film's title played on the nursery rhyme's theme of irreparable damage. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again, suggesting that some losses cannot be repaired or recovered. The company's disappearance represented this kind of final, irretrievable loss, names on memorial stones standing for bodies that never came home. After the war, the estate resumed its familiar rhythms. Shooting parties returned, agricultural work continued, and the physical landscape showed little visible change from the war years. But the memorial remained, and the gaps left by dead men had to be filled by others who worked in the knowledge that their predecessors had died serving the same nation that employed them on royal land. The relationship between house and workers had been permanently marked by the war's casualty lists. George V's own military background, he had served in the Royal Navy before becoming heir, made him perhaps more conscious of these losses than his father might have been. Edward VII had treated Sandringham primarily as sporting estate and social venue. George V's relationship with the place carried awareness of its role in the war that had dominated his early reign. The memorial on the grounds reminded him, if reminder were needed, that the estate's workforce had paid in blood for national service. The juxtaposition of the clock tower's dynastic memorial with the war memorial's collective commemoration revealed hierarchy of grief even in mourning. Albert Victor's death received architectural elaboration and permanent inscription on prominent tower. The Sandringham Company's death received a memorial stone at the edge of the park. Both losses mattered, but they mattered differently and were marked accordingly. The landscape of memory at Sandringham reflected the social structure that created it, even in moments of genuine shared grief. The estate workers who survived the war returned to labor that had changed little. The same coverts needed managing for shooting, the same gardens required maintenance, the same house demanded cleaning and heating, and the 1,000 tasks of daily service. The continuity of work provided stability, but also emphasized how individual lives could disappear while institutions persisted. The Sandringham Company was gone, but Sandringham itself continued, requiring new workers to perform the same roles their predecessors had filled before departing for Gallipoli. Photographs from the 1920s and 1930s show the war memorial in its landscape setting, stone weathering gradually, carved names remaining legible. The memorial had become part of Sandringham's permanent fixtures, another architectural element in grounds that now contained layers of meaning accumulated across decades. What had been built as pleasure ground had become memorial landscape, every view potentially containing reminder of loss alongside evidence of beauty and careful design. The clock tower kept measuring hours, still set ahead by half an hour, while the war memorial marked time that had stopped permanently for men whose names it preserved. The two monuments to death occupied the same landscape, visible from many of the same vantage points, contributing to an atmosphere where mortality was architecturally present even during moments of leisure and celebration. Sandringham had become a place where the past insisted on being remembered, where stone and inscription prevented forgetting even when remembering was uncomfortable. On Christmas Day 1932, George V sat in a room at Sandringham House and spoke into a microphone. His words, transmitted by the British Broadcasting Corporation, reached millions of listeners throughout the British Empire and beyond. The broadcast opened with a script written by Rudyard Kipling. "I speak now from my home and from my heart to you all." This first royal Christmas broadcast established a tradition that would continue for decades, transforming Sandringham from private retreat into the originating point for one of monarchy's most important annual communications. The choice to broadcast from Sandringham rather than from a London palace was deliberate. The phrase, "from my home," carried specific meaning. Sandringham was freehold property, personally owned rather than held in trust for the crown. Speaking from Norfolk emphasized the domestic personal character the broadcast was meant to convey, a king addressing his people from a family home rather than from institutional setting. The location helped frame the broadcast as intimate communication rather than state pronouncement. The room from which George V broadcast was within a house, still partly lit by gas from its own generating plant. Electric lighting had been installed in some areas, but much of Sandringham continued relying on Victorian gas systems. This technological layering, radio broadcasting from a partially gas-lit house, captured the estate's character in the 1930s, modern communications emanating from architecture and infrastructure that remained rooted in the previous century. The broadcast transformed the saloon temporarily into radio studio. BBC engineers installed equipment, tested acoustic properties of the room, and managed the technical requirements of live transmission. The King's voice, recorded onto wax disc as backup, traveled via telephone line to broadcasting facilities and from there to transmitters that sent it worldwide. The global reach of this technology, originating from a Norfolk country house, demonstrated how thoroughly modern communications had collapsed distance and made even remote locations potential centers of information distribution. 4 years after that first broadcast, George V's health failed. In January 1936, he took to his bedroom at Sandringham, suffering from bronchial illness that doctors quickly recognized as serious. He died there on the evening of 20th January 1936, in the same house where he had spent so many winters, where he had celebrated Christmas weeks before his final illness, where he had raised his family and pursued the shooting that remained his favorite recreation throughout his reign. The King's assistant private secretary, Sir Alan Tommy Lascelles, recorded the immediate aftermath in his memoir. George Fowler's coffin was carried through the gardens to St. Mary Magdalene Church, following a route that took mourners past the carefully maintained grounds the king had known throughout his life. Lascelles described estate workers standing guard along the path, their presence acknowledging the relationship between landowner and employees that had structured life at Sandringham since the estate's purchase in 1862. The church, which Lascelles characterized as "at the end of the garden," served as temporary resting place before the body was transported to London for lying in state and funeral. The small perpendicular-style building that had witnessed decades of Sunday services now received the coffin of a king who had worshipped there throughout his residence at Sandringham. The silver altar and pulpit that Queen Alexandra had donated years earlier now framed her son's coffin in the building she had helped beautify. From St. Mary Magdalene, George V's body traveled by train from nearby Wolferton Station to London, beginning the transition from private family grief to state mourning. Wolferton had served as the estate's railway connection since Victorian times, the small station receiving royal trains and delivering guests who would spend weekends shooting or attending house parties. Now it dispatched a funeral train, the same infrastructure that had enabled leisure serving the logistics of death. One of Edward VIII's first acts as king was to order immediate end to Sandringham time. The clocks were reset to Greenwich Mean Time, eliminating the half-hour offset that had characterized the estate for more than 60 years. This decision, made within days of his father's death, symbolically aligned Sandringham with the rest of the world. The temporal peculiarity that had distinguished the estate, that had embodied royal prerogative to organize even time according to preference, was abolished. The symbolic weight of this change was significant. Sandringham time had represented the estate's singular character, its operating according to rules different from everywhere else. Eliminating it suggested that the new king viewed such peculiarities as anachronistic, that modern monarchy should not maintain temporal fictions even for practical purposes like extending shooting hours. The clock tower, built to memorialize Albert Victor and inscribed with warnings about perishing hours, now measured ordinary hours like clocks everywhere else. Edward VIII's reign lasted less than a year. His abdication in December 1936 meant Sandringham passed to George VI, who had grown up in the house and knew it intimately as both home and royal estate. George VI maintained the reset clocks. Sandringham time would not return, but otherwise continued using the estate much as his father had, spending winters in Norfolk and using the house for Christmas gatherings. On the 6th of February 1952, 16 years after his brother's abdication, George VI died in his sleep at Sandringham. He was 56 years old, weakened by lung cancer and cardiovascular disease. His death occurred in one of the house's upper bedrooms in the early morning hours after he had spent the previous evening dining with family. He went to bed apparently in stable health and was found dead the following morning, having passed away quietly during the night. The repetition was extraordinary. 2 kings, father and son, dying in the same house, both in their bedrooms, both during winter residence. Sandringham, built as retreat and pleasure ground, had become the place where George V and George VI both ended their reigns and their lives. The house witnessed their final illnesses, held their bodies before transport to London, and marked the transition from one reign to the next in the most final way possible. George VI's body, like his father's, made the journey from Sandringham through St. Mary Magdalene to Wolferton Station, and then to London for state funeral. The same route, the same small church, the same railway station, the infrastructure of royal death at Sandringham had established pattern through repetition. The estate had developed protocols for managing these transitions, staff knowing their roles because they had performed them 16 years earlier. The clock tower, built for Albert Victor and reset to Greenwich time by Edward VIII, now stood witness to the deaths of 2 reigning kings. What had begun as memorial to one lost heir had accumulated layers of meaning through subsequent losses. The tower that measured hours also measured reigns, its presence constant, while monarchs changed through death and abdication. Its inscription about perishing hours had proven prophetic in ways its designers perhaps had not intended. Hours perish, lives end, and even kings die in their bedrooms in Norfolk country houses. The house designed for leisure had become a royal hospice, the site where illness turned fatal and death arrived in rooms meant for rest and comfort. The red bricks absorbed the sound of microphones, broadcasting Christmas messages and last breaths with equal neutrality. Architecture contains whatever uses humans require of it, transforming from pleasure palace to broadcasting studio to sick room according to need. Sandringham's spaces had proven adaptable to these varying purposes, the building serving whatever role the moment demanded. Between the two royal deaths, life at Sandringham had continued its familiar patterns. Shooting parties gathered in autumn and winter, families celebrated Christmas in the saloon, and the estate's agricultural and forestry operations proceeded according to seasonal rhythms. But the deaths of George V and George VI permanently marked the house, adding to its accumulating identity as a place where mortality repeatedly asserted itself despite wealth, status, and the best available medical care. The clock tower kept ticking, now keeping accurate time, its bells marking hours that perished as the inscription warned. The memorial built for one death had witnessed two more, its role expanding from dynastic monument to silent witness of royal mortality. In photographs from the 1950s, the tower appears unchanged from earlier decades, its stone weathered but its form intact, a vertical element in a landscape where much had changed even as architecture persisted. After George V's death in 1936 and the subsequent brief reign of Edward VIII, Sandringham's physical fabric began to change in ways that reflected new economic realities. The mid-20th century posed challenges for maintaining Victorian-scale country houses. Labor costs increased as service employment became less attractive to workers who had other options. Heating expenses for enormous buildings with outdated systems strained even royal budgets. And buildings constructed in the 1870s and 1880s faced the inevitable deterioration that comes with decades of use and insufficient maintenance during war years. By the 1970s, these pressures had become severe enough to require radical action. In 1975, nearly 100 rooms in the service wing were demolished due to dry rot and the prohibitive cost of heating spaces that were no longer necessary for the house's operation. Architectural reports and contemporary press coverage described the decision as practical response to changed circumstances. The Victorian service infrastructure, extensive sculleries, servants' halls, storage rooms, and the complex warren of back-of-house spaces that had made Edwardian comfort possible, was simply no longer needed or economically sustainable. Photographs from the demolition period show blank gables where rooms once stood, service corridors ending abruptly at new exterior walls, and ghosted rooflines visible on brick where removed structures had protected surfaces from weathering. The building's profile changed, becoming noticeably smaller when viewed from certain angles. What had once been continuous roofline now showed gaps and terminations, architectural evidence of reduction. The demolition represented first major disappearance at Sandringham, not of the facade or principal rooms, but of the backstage infrastructure that had made the visible house function. The service wing's elimination erased the architecture of labor, the spaces where dozens of servants had worked to maintain aristocratic comfort. These rooms had been invisible to guests but essential to operation. Their removal acknowledged that the house now operated with far fewer staff and that maintaining unused spaces made no economic sense. The floor plan was reorganized in conjunction with the demolition. Remaining service areas were consolidated and updated with more efficient equipment. The sprawling Victorian service infrastructure, designed when labor was cheap and fuel relatively affordable, was replaced with compact modern facilities that required fewer workers and less energy. The house adapted to changed economic circumstances by reducing its physical footprint and modernizing its remaining systems. Domestic service contracts had been shrinking throughout the 20th century. The large staffs of live-in servants that characterized Edwardian country house life had given way to smaller teams working shorter hours. The social changes that made service employment less attractive, better wages in other sectors, improved education creating more opportunities, and changing attitudes about the acceptability of domestic service as career, all contributed to reducing the workforce available for maintaining great houses. Sandringham adapted by accepting these limitations. Staff numbers that had once reached into the hundreds were reduced to dozens. The house still required significant maintenance and staffing, but the scale was a fraction of what Victorian operation had demanded. This reduction in human infrastructure necessitated corresponding reduction in physical infrastructure. The rooms where large staffs had worked and lived were no longer necessary and became expensive liabilities. Official guidebooks from the 1970s onward began emphasizing that 5 principal rooms are open to the public, a careful phrasing that acknowledged most of the house remained private while inviting visitors to see selected spaces. This represented significant shift in the house's relationship with the public. What had been entirely private royal residence was now partially open for tourism, allowing carefully managed public access to ground-floor staterooms while maintaining family privacy in upper floors and private wings. The rooms shown to visitors, saloon, drawing room, dining room, ballroom, and 1 or 2 others depending on season, represented Sandringham at its most impressive. These were spaces that had changed least since Victorian times, still furnished with original pieces, still displaying the accumulated decorative objects of royal residence. Visitors saw the house as stage set for aristocratic life, carefully curated to present particular image, while most of the building remained unseen. The service wing demolition, though practical necessity, represented acknowledgement that Sandringham could no longer function as originally designed. The building had been created for a way of life that no longer existed, dependent on economic and social structures that had changed fundamentally. Rather than attempting to maintain architectural fiction that circumstances had made obsolete, the decision was made to reduce the building to scale that could be realistically sustained. From the gardens and park, the clock tower remained unchanged, still the prominent vertical element in the skyline. But the service corridors and staircases it had overlooked were partially gone, demolished, their roots through the building erased. The tower stood as a permanent feature, while the architecture around it proved negotiable, subject to modification based on practical requirements rather than historical sentiment. Conservation reports from this period documented the challenges of maintaining Victorian buildings with 20th century budgets and technology. Dry rot, the problem that precipitated the service wing demolition, was endemic in older buildings where ventilation and damp proofing had not been properly managed. The extensive timber framing, typical of Victorian construction, provided ideal conditions for fungal growth, and treatment required not just eliminating existing infestation, but addressing moisture problems that allowed it to develop. Heating remained a perpetual challenge. The house had been designed in an era when coal was cheap and labor to maintain fires was readily available. Converting to more efficient heating systems required expensive retrofitting of buildings not designed for central heating distribution. Radiators and pipe runs had to be added to spaces where Victorian architects had assumed fireplaces would provide warmth. The costs of heating Sandringham's hundreds of rooms, even with modern systems, remained substantial. Press coverage of the service wing demolition framed it as sensible modernization rather than architectural loss. Articles emphasized cost savings and practical benefits of more compact operation. There was little sentiment expressed for the demolished spaces. They had been utilitarian rooms never seen by anyone but servants, without architectural distinction or historical significance beyond their function. The demolition was presented as pruning unnecessary growth, returning the house to more sustainable scale. Yet the reduction represented something beyond mere practical adjustment. It acknowledged that the vision of aristocratic life that created Sandringham, the assumption of unlimited cheap labor, the expectation that great houses would be maintained regardless of cost, the social structure that made such establishments possible, was gone. The house was adapting to survive, but survival required abandoning pretense that circumstances remained unchanged from Victorian times. The ghosted rooflines visible on brick walls told the story more honestly than any official statement. These marks showed where buildings once stood, where rooms once contained the daily labor that made aristocratic comfort possible. Now those spaces were simply absent, their functions consolidated or eliminated, their architecture reduced to faint traces on surfaces that had been interior walls and were now exterior cladding. The service wing demolition was not unique to Sandringham. Throughout Britain in the 1960s and 1970s, great houses faced similar decisions. Many were demolished entirely, unable to find sustainable uses. Others, like Sandringham, survived by reducing scale and accepting change. The pattern was consistent. Backstage spaces disappeared first, infrastructure was modernized at expense of historical accuracy, and buildings adapted through loss rather than preservation. From visitors' perspective, approaching the house from the front drive, the changes were invisible. The principal facade remained intact, showing the same Jacobethan gables and red brick that Humbert had designed a century earlier. The porte-cochere still provided covered entrance to the saloon. The clock tower still measured hours, its face visible from the approach. Only from certain angles, or from detailed study of old photographs compared to present reality, did the reduction become apparent. Inside, tourists walking through the 5 public rooms saw spaces that appeared largely unchanged from their Edwardian peak. Original furniture remained in place, decorative objects accumulated over decades still filled surfaces, and nothing immediately suggested the extensive modifications happening elsewhere in the building. The curated experience presented continuity, carefully managing what visitors could see and understand about how the house had actually changed. The eliminated service spaces, invisible to tourists and barely mourned in public discourse, represented the labor that had made everything else possible. Their demolition acknowledged what had always been true but rarely stated. The visible grandeur depended entirely on invisible infrastructure, and when economic realities no longer supported that infrastructure, the grandeur had to adapt or disappear. Sandringham chose adaptation, surviving by accepting reduction, maintaining facade while acknowledging that what lay behind it had changed irrevocably. On 25 December 1952, 10 months after George II's death at Sandringham, Queen Elizabeth II delivered her first Christmas message from the same house where her father had died. She was 26 years old, thrust into monarchy by her father's premature death, and the Christmas broadcast represented one of her first major public communications as Queen. The choice to broadcast from Sandringham continued the tradition George V had established in 1932. Maintaining the association between this Norfolk house and the monarchy's annual Christmas address to the nation and Commonwealth. The broadcast came from one of the house's principal rooms, the space arranged to accommodate BBC equipment while maintaining domestic appearance. Elizabeth II's message acknowledged the difficulties of the year, her father's death, her own accession, the adjustments required of her young family. But the location itself provided continuity, suggesting that despite personal and national changes, certain traditions persisted. The king's death had occurred at Sandringham. The new queen's Christmas message originated from the same house, creating a cycle of endings and beginnings architecturally anchored to Norfolk. 5 years later, in 1957, Elizabeth II made the first televised Christmas broadcast, again from Sandringham. This innovation brought cameras into the long library, a wood-paneled room lined with books and family photographs, chosen specifically for its domestic character and visual warmth. The Queen acknowledged the medium's novelty, referring to television as this new medium that allowed subjects to see as well as hear their sovereign. The technical requirements of television, lights, cameras, sound equipment, and production crew, temporarily transformed the private library into broadcast studio. Archival footage of that first television broadcast shows the Queen seated at a desk, the long library's paneling and bookshelves visible behind her, family photographs deliberately positioned to be caught by camera. The domestic staging was careful and intentional. This was not throne room or state apartment, but comfortable study in a family home. The setting suggested accessibility and normalcy, even while the broadcast reached millions of viewers throughout the world. The decision to use the long library rather than more formal spaces reflected evolving understanding of how television would shape public perception of monarchy. The medium's intimacy, its ability to bring images directly into ordinary living rooms, required different approach than radio's disembodied voice. Viewers needed to see the monarch in recognizably domestic setting, engaged in activity, speaking to camera, that resembled personal communication rather than ceremonial pronouncement. The contrast between the room's scale and the broadcast's reach was extraordinary. The long library was not large, essentially a private study, comfortably furnished but not grand. Yet from this modest space, the Queen's image and voice traveled to televisions in cities and villages throughout the Commonwealth and beyond. The same house that hosted shooting parties and family gatherings became, for those few minutes, the center of a technological network connecting millions of viewers across continents. The clock tower, visible through long library windows in certain camera angles, appeared occasionally in broadcast footage, a brief glimpse of Sandringham's exterior architecture during a message focused on interior domesticity. These accidental inclusions reminded viewers of the broadcast's location, anchoring the Queen's words to the specific building that had housed so much royal history and that had become synonymous with the family's Christmas celebrations. Subsequent Christmas broadcasts from Sandringham followed similar patterns, using various rooms but maintaining the emphasis on domestic setting. The house became visually familiar to television audiences who would never visit Norfolk, but who saw selected rooms annually. This media familiarity created paradox. Sandringham remained private royal residence, closed to most public access, yet its interiors were simultaneously among the most widely viewed spaces in Britain through television broadcasts. The Christmas broadcasts transformed Sandringham from place of private royal leisure to platform for public royal communication. What George V had begun with radio, Elizabeth II expanded with television, making the house a recurring element in the monarchy's media presence. The building's architecture and decoration became part of how the public understood royal life, not the formal ceremonial aspects conducted in palaces, but the supposedly more authentic domestic life lived in country house setting. The broadcast footage was carefully controlled, showing only what palace officials and television producers agreed to reveal. Cameras captured specific angles of specific rooms, lit and furnished to present particular image. Viewers saw comfortable domestic spaces filled with books, photographs, and the accumulated objects of family life. What they did not see were the extensive areas off camera, the service spaces, the private family quarters, the rooms closed even to tourist access. The broadcasts created an impression of intimacy while maintaining strict control over what was actually revealed. The long library, once simply a room where books were stored and family members could read privately, acquired public identity through television. It became the room where the Queen gives her Christmas message, its architecture and decoration familiar to viewers who could describe its paneling and bookcases from memory. This transformation from private to semi-public space occurred without physical modification. The room itself did not change, but its meaning and recognition did. The technical evolution of broadcasting mirrored broader changes in media technology. George V's radio broadcast required relatively simple equipment: microphone, amplifier, and telephone line to transmission facility. Elizabeth II's television broadcast needed far more complex infrastructure: cameras, lights, sound equipment, and crews to operate it all. The house absorbed these technological intrusions periodically, rooms temporarily becoming television studios before returning to normal domestic function after broadcast completion. The Christmas broadcast tradition anchored Sandringham to the annual calendar of royal activities in new way. The house had always been important for Christmas gatherings, but television made those gatherings part of national Christmas ritual. Millions of Britons watched the Queen's message from Sandringham as part of their own Christmas Day routine, creating connection between private family celebrations in ordinary homes and royal celebration in Norfolk country house. The broadcasts also established visual vocabulary for how monarchy appeared on television: the domestic settings, the informal staging, the direct address to camera. All of this developed through Christmas messages filmed at Sandringham and similar locations. These broadcasts helped define television's role in presenting monarchy to modern audiences, demonstrating that the medium could show royalty in contexts that suggested accessibility while maintaining appropriate distance. The clock tower, when it appeared in broadcast footage, served as visual identifier of location. Viewers familiar with Sandringham from news coverage or published photographs recognized the tower's distinctive profile, confirming that the broadcast originated from the family's Norfolk estate. The tower functioned as architectural signature, allowing those who cared about such details to place the Queen's words in specific geographic and architectural context. The house's role as broadcast location represented another layer of meaning added to architecture designed for different purposes. The saloon, drawing room, and long library had been created as private family spaces and venues for entertaining guests. Television broadcasts added public dimension to these rooms without fundamentally changing their primary functions. Between broadcasts, they remained private spaces used by family and invited guests, their occasional media appearances not disrupting their ongoing domestic purposes. Press coverage of the broadcasts typically included exterior photographs of Sandringham, showing the house in winter landscape, often with references to the royal family's Christmas residence there. These images reinforced association between the building and the monarchy's public image, making Sandringham recognizable even to people who had never visited Norfolk and who knew the estate only through media representation. The broadcasts from Sandringham demonstrated how 20th-century communications technology transformed relationship between monarchy and public. What had been private royal residence became, at specific moments, the most public of spaces, the origin point for messages reaching millions. The house accommodated this dual role, maintaining privacy most of the time while periodically opening selected spaces to cameras that carried images worldwide. The architecture that had been designed to house private life found new purpose housing public communication, adapting to changed circumstances through flexibility of use rather than structural modification. Today, Sandringham operates as working estate, encompassing approximately 20,000 acres of Norfolk countryside. The property combines multiple functions: active agriculture, managed forestry, formal gardens open to tourists, and private royal residence. This combination requires careful spatial organization and management to allow these different activities to coexist on the same landscape without interfering with each other. Around 6,000 hectares are devoted to organic farmland, where modern and heritage grain varieties grow in carefully planned rotations. The estate achieved organic certification for its agricultural operations, representing commitment to farming practices that avoid synthetic pesticides and fertilizers. Crops include wheat, barley, and rye, staple grains whose cultivation in Norfolk stretches back centuries, though current methods incorporate contemporary understanding of sustainable agriculture. The estate maintains flocks of Aberfield sheep and herds of beef shorthorn cattle, grazing on pasture and rougher land unsuitable for crop cultivation. These livestock operations function as legitimate commercial farming, producing meat marketed through normal agricultural channels. The animals graze under the same Norfolk sky that witnessed Victorian shooting parties, though their presence serves economic rather than purely aesthetic purposes. Forestry management continues on estate woodlands, with timber harvested sustainably and replanting ensuring continued forest cover. The woods that once served primarily as game cover now contribute to the estate's economic viability through planned timber production. Modern forestry practices balance commercial harvest with habitat preservation, maintaining woodland that serves multiple purposes: economic resource, wildlife habitat, and aesthetic landscape element. The formal gardens, covering approximately 60 acres, remain major attraction for visitors who come to see designed landscapes that have evolved over more than a century. The lakes, edged with Pulamite rockwork installed in Victorian era, reflect sky and surrounding plantings in compositions that appear natural, but result from careful design and ongoing maintenance. Pulamite, artificial rock made from cement and aggregate, allowed Victorian designers to create picturesque rocky edges for water features without the expense of transporting actual stone. Queen Alexandra's nest, a summer house built during her residence, survives as garden feature and historic structure. The building provides focal point in designed landscape, its architecture contributing to the picturesque qualities that Victorian garden design sought to achieve. Visitors walking garden paths encounter this structure as both functional shelter and aesthetic object, evidence of personal royal patronage in landscape design. Since 2023, under King Charles III, a new topiary garden has been developed, featuring more than 5,000 yew trees trained into geometric and organic forms. This recent addition demonstrates that Sandringham's landscape continues evolving, new elements being added even as historic features are preserved. The topiary represents substantial investment in long-term landscape design. Yews grow slowly, and the full effect of this planting will take decades to achieve. The former coach house now serves as museum, displaying royal vehicles, gifts received by the family over generations, and Fabergé animals modeled on Sandringham's own livestock. The Fabergé pieces represent particular intersection of art and estate identity, luxury objects whose subjects are ordinary farm animals from the Norfolk property. This combination of high art craft and agricultural subject matter captures something essential about Sandringham's dual character as working farm and royal residence. Visitors following the public route through the house see ground floor rooms, saloon, drawing room, dining room, ballroom, furnished with original pieces and decorated much as they appeared during the estate's Edwardian peak. These rooms remain remarkably complete, showing how Victorian and Edwardian royalty chose to live when in the country. The decorative density typical of the period, paintings covering walls, objects filling every surface, rich textiles on furniture, is preserved and maintained. Most of the house remains private, closed to tourist access. Upper floors where family bedrooms are located, private wings used during current royal residence, and remaining service areas all exist beyond the public route. Visitors see carefully selected spaces that present particular image of royal domestic life, while the majority of the building remains invisible to them. This controlled access allows tourism and private residence to coexist in same structure. The estate achieved Grade Turn listing for its house, gardens, and park, recognition by Historic England that the complex represents particularly important example of Victorian country house architecture, lived in and beautifully maintained, complete with its original contents, gardens, and dependent estate buildings. The listing acknowledges both architectural significance and unusual completeness. Many comparable houses have been demolished, stripped of contents, or so extensively modified that their original character is lost. The listing description emphasizes Sandringham's survival as functioning estate rather than museum piece. The house is lived in by the royal family during parts of each year, the farms operate commercially, and the gardens are actively maintained rather than simply preserved in historic state. This living quality distinguishes Sandringham from country houses that survive only as tourist attractions or have been converted to other uses like hotels or apartments. Many visitors photograph the clock tower without knowing its memorial origins or its inscription about perishing hours. For most tourists, the tower is simply prominent architectural feature, part of the picturesque skyline that makes Sandringham visually distinctive. The tower's layers of meaning, time regulator, memorial to Albert Victor, witness to royal deaths, remain invisible to casual visitors who see it as decorative element rather than monument. Current estate publications and visitor guides present carefully curated narrative about Sandringham's history and current operations. The story emphasizes continuity, careful stewardship, and the family's long association with Norfolk. The narrative is selective, foregrounding elements that present the estate positively while minimizing or omitting aspects that might complicate public perception. The scale of Victorian game slaughter, the tensions between game preservation and tenant farming, or the extent of mid-20th century reduction through demolition. Environmental and organic farming reports document the estate's commitment to sustainable agricultural practices, providing data on crop yields, soil health, and biodiversity preservation. These reports serve dual purposes. They demonstrate responsible land management to regulatory authorities and public stakeholders, and they support the estate's marketing of itself as model of sustainable aristocratic land ownership in the 21st century. The estate's survival requires balancing multiple, sometimes competing priorities. Tourism generates revenue and maintains public support for royal land ownership, but it requires managing visitor access without disrupting private family use or compromising security. Commercial farming provides income and keeps agricultural land productive, but it must be conducted profitably while meeting organic certification standards. Preservation of historic buildings and landscapes costs substantial money, requiring ongoing investment in maintenance and conservation. Conservation work continues addressing challenges of maintaining Victorian buildings and designed landscapes, Reports document repairs to brick and stone, treatment of recurring dry rot, upgrades to heating and electrical systems, and the specialized work required to preserve decorative elements like carved wood and plasterwork. Each intervention requires balancing historic preservation principles with practical needs. Buildings must be kept functional and safe while preserving their architectural character. The clock tower itself has required periodic maintenance, mechanism servicing, weather-resistant coating for stone surfaces, and structural assessment to ensure the tower remains sound. The memorial inscription, exposed to Norfolk weather for more than a century, has been recarved or cleaned to maintain legibility. This ongoing work, largely invisible to visitors, keeps the tower functioning as timepiece and memorial while preventing deterioration that would compromise its structural integrity. Visitor numbers, though not publicly disclosed in detail, provide significant revenue that helps support the estate's operations. Admission fees, gift shop sales, and catering income all contribute to the complex's financial sustainability. The estate functions as business enterprise requiring careful financial management, its romantic image as royal country seat coexisting with pragmatic reality of managing assets that must generate income to justify their continued existence. Sandringham's survival into the 21st century results from this careful balancing of uses and meanings. The estate accommodates tourism, agriculture, forestry, private residence, and heritage preservation simultaneously, each activity occupying specific spaces and times that allow coexistence. The house that began as private refuge has evolved into complex operation, requiring professional management, skilled staff, and substantial ongoing investment to maintain. The clock tower remains where it has stood since the 1870s, its face weathered but legible, its mechanism still marking hours as precisely as when first installed. The memorial inscription, Horae perunt et imputantur, the hours perish and will be charged to our account, survives in stone, its Latin text unchanged despite more than a century of Norfolk weather, wearing gradually at the carved surfaces. Visitors approaching Sandringham from the main drive see the tower as prominent vertical element in the roofline, a piece of Victorian architecture that has outlasted many of the building's other components. Inside the entrance hall, the marble plaque installed in 1870 remains affixed to the wall where Humbert's architects placed it. This house was built by Albert Edward, Prince of Wales, and Alexandra, his wife, in the year of our Lord 1870. The inscription, like the clock tower's memorial text, makes claims about permanence and achievement. A building raised, a dynastic statement made in brick and stone, a record carved where it cannot be easily erased. Neither inscription mentions that the house would be reduced in size, that rooms would be demolished, or that the building would eventually open to tourism. They capture only the moment of creation and dedication, freezing in text and optimism about permanence that subsequent history complicated. In museum display cases, fragments tell quieter stories. Pieces of plaster from demolished sections sit beneath glass, labeled with notes identifying which rooms they came from and when those spaces were eliminated. Photographs show the service wing before demolition, architectural documentation preserving visual record of spaces that no longer physically exist. Old floor plans, marked with annotations indicating modifications and reductions, map the building's evolution through addition and subtraction. These archival materials acknowledge what the public tour route does not, that Sandringham has changed substantially, that its current form represents choices made about what to preserve and what to eliminate. Conservation reports, filed regularly with Historic England and maintained in estate archives, document ongoing work required to stabilize brick, manage visitor impact on historic interiors, and adapt heating systems to 21st century efficiency standards while working within constraints of listed building protection. These technical documents describe the mundane reality of historic preservation, treating damp, repairing mortar, upgrading wiring, replacing deteriorated timbers. Each intervention represents negotiation between maintaining historic character and ensuring the building remains functional and safe. The reports reveal that preserving Sandringham requires constant vigilance against decay. Water infiltration threatens masonry, biological growth damages stone, thermal cycling causes materials to crack and separate, and simple age makes everything gradually more fragile. Conservation is not one-time accomplishment, but ongoing process requiring inspection, treatment, and maintenance in perpetual cycle. The house survives not because it is inherently permanent, but because resources are continuously invested in preventing its deterioration. Television cameras still return to Sandringham at Christmas, documenting the royal family's walk to St. Mary Magdalene Church on Christmas morning. News coverage shows the familiar facade, the clock tower, the carefully maintained grounds. These annual images reinforce Sandringham's place in national consciousness, making the building recognizable even to those who have never visited and providing visual continuity in media coverage of royal life across decades. Yet most people who know Sandringham know it through photographs rather than direct experience. Archival images from Victorian and Edwardian periods, glossy magazine spreads showing the house today, digital photographs shared on social media. These representations constitute how the building exists in public imagination. The actual physical structure in Norfolk is less important in practical terms than the accumulated visual record that allows Sandringham to circulate as image independent of its material reality. The film dissolves slowly from modern color photograph to early black and white image, showing the same facade across time. The Victorian photograph shows newly built walls, fresh brickwork, and grounds still developing toward their designed appearance. The modern photograph shows weathered stone, mature landscaping, and the accumulated wear of 150 years. Yet the building is recognizably the same. The architectural elements Humbert designed remain legible despite modifications and decades of use. A further dissolve reveals architectural drawings, Humbert's elevations showing the house as planned rather than as built, precise lines in ink on paper representing the building as abstract idea before construction made it physical reality. These drawings, preserved in archives, show Sandringham at its most perfect. No weathering, no modifications, no compromises between design intent and built result. The house exists here as pure architectural vision, the form it took in an architect's mind before bricks and mortar translated imagination into material fact. The clock tower appears in all these representations, photographs, drawings, conservation reports, television footage. It provides continuity across different ways of documenting the building, a consistent element whose presence helps identify Sandringham regardless of medium or moment. The tower that measures time has itself been measured repeatedly, captured in images that freeze it at specific moments even as the actual structure continues aging and changing. Conservation reports note that the clock mechanism requires regular servicing to maintain accuracy. The tower's stone surfaces need periodic treatment to protect against water infiltration and frost damage. The memorial inscription, though carved deep, must be monitored for deterioration that could make it illegible. Even this symbol of permanence requires ongoing care, its continued existence dependent on human intervention rather than inherent durability of materials. Museum labels explaining architectural fragments employ careful language. They describe rather than lament, presenting demolition and modification as facts of the building's history rather than as losses to be mourned. A piece of carved wood from the eliminated service wing is identified by location and date of removal, with brief note about the decision to demolish unused spaces. The label treats this as historical information, part of the building's evolution, not as tragedy requiring emotional response. The approach reflects contemporary preservation philosophy that accepts change as an inevitable part of any building's existence. Structures are not static. They accumulate modifications, lose original elements, and adapt to new uses. Preservation means managing change rather than preventing it, making conscious decisions about what to keep and what to modify, rather than attempting to freeze buildings in idealized past states that may never have actually existed. Sandringham demonstrates this principle clearly. The building has been substantially modified from its 1870 form, enlarged in the 1880s, reduced in the 1970s, continuously updated with modern systems, and adapted for partial public access. Yet, it retains enough original character to be recognizable as the house Humbert designed. The architecture accommodated these changes through inherent flexibility and through willingness of successive owners to modify rather than stubbornly maintain original configuration. The clock tower keeps ticking, its mechanism advancing through seconds and minutes and hours that accumulate into days and years. Each chime marks time passing, sound carrying across grounds that have changed substantially since the tower was built. The memorial inscription about perishing hours remains relevant. Time continues passing, buildings continue aging, and every structure moves closer to eventual dissolution regardless of efforts to preserve it. In photographs, Sandringham can last forever. The archival images show the building at various stages of its existence, preserved in amber of photographic emulsion or digital files. These images do not age or deteriorate in the way buildings do. Properly stored, they remain unchanged across decades and centuries. The Sandringham that exists in visual archives is in some sense more durable than the actual building in Norfolk, more resistant to decay, more certain to survive into distant future. But under the clock tower, on the ground where bricks rest on Norfolk sand, the hours keep proving otherwise. Materials weather, structures settle, systems require updating, and buildings either adapt or disappear. Sandringham has adapted, surviving through flexibility rather than rigidity, accepting change rather than attempting to remain frozen in idealized past. The house that was built to express permanence persists by acknowledging that nothing is truly permanent, that survival requires accepting modification, and that architecture serves present needs rather than past intentions. The final image holds on the clock tower at dusk, its face illuminated, its mechanism advancing through another evening. The inscription about perishing hours is barely visible in fading light, but its message remains clear even when the text cannot be read. Time passes, buildings change, and all accounts eventually come due. The tower that has measured more than a century of Sandringham hours continues its work, counting down toward whatever future awaits the house below.